Hey everybody, welcome back to the Wisdom Tradition Podcast. This is Alex Sakin. In today's episode, I'm going to be examining the life and career of a figure named Adam Trombly, who I believe is still alive today. I'm going to go over an extended series of clips from a 4-hour interview that he did about 15 years ago, where he tells his life story and he also talks about the research that he got involved in. And the reason I want to examine his career and the reason I think it's important is that Adam Trombly was somebody who followed in the footsteps of Tesla. He was an engineer and he attempted to make a quote-unquote free energy device or a power generation device that taps into the ether. And he's one of a category of inventors who over the years have attempted, and many have succeeded in creating such a device. But in looking at Adam Trombly's story as he tells it himself, we'll see how there's an invisible presence, an invisible governance structure that swoops in every single case and basically either shuts the project down or takes it into itself and classifies it. And so his life is an example of how in the Black Projects world there's a monopoly on this paradigm of physics, and there's going to be no outside reinvention allowed independent of its own hold on this technology. So his life is an example of this. Now, I want to say that the way he interprets some of the things that he's experienced, he offers some interpretations about things like aliens or extraterrestrials and how that might interface with this. And as you know, I think that conceals a deeper story. That's one that I don't think Adam Trombly is aware of, the one that I talk about in my book, The Coming World Nation. So when he's trying to make sense of some of these things, he falls back on an alien hypothesis that, as listeners of the podcast know, I don't agree with. So I just want to say that caveat, that I'm not endorsing everything that he says, but I think it's interesting the way he interprets it, and certainly his career and his encounters with this invisible governance structure are important. It's like a case study for the thesis that I do lay out in my book, The Coming World Nation. And so in today's episode, we're going to be looking at about 2 hours worth of clips drawn from this 4-hour interview. It's from Spectrum Radio Network. I'm going to play the tag of the channel that it was originally broadcast on all those years ago. So I want to cite them and credit them. But yeah, this has been out there for a long time. I first encountered it over 10 years ago and I always remembered it. And so now that I've written my own theory and published it in my book, The Coming World Nation, it seems an appropriate time to go back in and revisit this lecture. And so I'm excited to share it with you. Some of you may know Adam Trombly or be familiar with him because he was featured in a pretty popular documentary that also came out about 15 or 20 years ago called Thrive. What's unique about this documentary is that it does factor in this world of etheric energy and Black projects. So it's a very interesting doc, particularly ahead of his time for when it came out. Anyway, he's featured in it. So to get an intro into his life, I want to start off by playing some clips from the Thrive documentary that he's featured in. So this is going to just kind of give an introduction to his career as a researcher in the field of etheric energy. And then he's going to also just give us some insights into the nature of etheric energy and what it means about our relationship with space and how space itself is alive and this very dynamic, energetic medium. So let's hear from Adam Trombly.
A modern-day inventor, Adam Trombly, was inspired by Tesla's work and by the possibilities of the torus. Trombly built a dynamo, a direct current generator that accessed electrical power right out of the air.
We were trying to demonstrate that by mimicking the magnetic field of a planet and rotating this device, we could actually create a dynamo that would work. And in fact, it did work, and it does work. So when we contemplate nature, when we contemplate Jupiter, or we contemplate a dynamo like the Earth rotating in space, we're basically talking about a magnet which is rotating in space. And the lines of flux of the magnet are pouring down and through in this toroidal pattern of the magnetic field. It's also expanding and contracting. It's breathing. It's taking in the energy of space literally and transforming it. Right here in this toroid, we have enough energy to transform the entire Earth. And that's not just a theoretical statement, it's literally true. To contemplate the implications of this means that every single place on Earth suddenly has power. Every single person on Earth suddenly has power. We have universal abundance. We can actually create the conditions whereby we're creating this breathing
taking in the energy of space, radiating out the energy of space, transforming the energy of space, then we have enough power to commit miracles instead of just atrocities. Instead of destroying the earth, we can heal the earth. And each and every person, even without any technology, needs to realize that, most importantly of all, we must realize that we are the technology. We are the technology. We are the element that is absolutely necessary for this transformation to occur. We are the element that can actually use this, not just in terms of technology, but even in terms of our prayer. And I mean prayer in terms of, I mean it not in scientific materialistic terms only, but I mean in terms of the physics of prayer, the physics of spirit. Spirit isn't just something that's abstract, it is the context in which we appear. And this is where things have gone really haywire with scientific materialism. This isn't about evolution versus not evolution versus creationism. This is about understanding that we have a dynamic, very real and practical interface in all moments with this infinite power, with this infinite presence. And so what the atom and molecule, when we discover this kind of technology really works, in the process of discovering it, we realize something about ourselves. We realize that, hey, we're not discrete entities. We're not like separated from space. We're actually seated in the midst of this context, and our context is infinite. Our context has no boundaries. We've been told for a long time there's an energy crisis. And just one of the things about so-called UFOs is that they defy all kinds of laws of physics. And one of the things that they obviously defy is in terms of the energetic source by which they operate. There's no nuclear source material. What is it? You know? And so when you really explore that subject, you discover that it isn't just like from aliens that this comes from, it's also from humans like Nikola Tesla, who in the 1890s physically demonstrated this principle. And yet, all we got from Nikola Tesla was the AC dynamo. So what I decided to do was I decided that I would try to find a way to reduce to practice an electrical generator that actually produced more electrical power than it used. In June of 1989, a former co-worker and I and a security guard and driver drove a van across the United States to Washington, D.C. and New York City. We went to a large NGO conference at Dog Harbor Shoal Auditorium, and where we were scheduled to demonstrate this in front of the whole auditorium. As we arrived at the United Nations, in fact, we were already in the garage. We had one of those big early cell phones back then. And the director of the New York office of the United Nations Environment Program called me up and says, Adam, I'm sorry to tell you, you can't do the demonstration for the whole auditorium because there are security issues. But we do have a venue down the street at the Church of the Holy Covenant, which is an old abandoned church which we use for such occasions. So instead of the entire auditorium of people seeing the physical demonstration, only 50 people got to see it. But 50 people got to see it, including a senior engineer from Boeing Corporation. We went and we physically demonstrated this technology to these people. I believed in that moment, as did these delegations from all over the world of the United Nations, in this packed house, that this was the moment that would change history. We had just physically demonstrated 50 times more electrical power coming out of something that caused no pollution, that used no fuel whatsoever. People were just ecstatic. The guy from Boeing had stood up and said, well, I can't tell you how it works, but I guarantee you it does work and there are no tricks. Holy mackerel. This should have been huge news, you know? This should have been huge news. This happened in June of 1989. And I was interviewed for hours afterwards, and somebody made a call from the White House, literally, to every major news organization in New York City. We found this out later and said, this would be a violation of national security if you broadcast these interviews. So, yes, there are practical political obstructions.
Okay, now that we've got this introduction out of the way, we're going to jump into the long-form interview that I've cut down and remixed and cut into sections. So we're going to be going through this bit by bit. And to start off with, we're going to hear Adam Trombly talk about his upbringing, and he's going to introduce his father and some of the mysterious circumstances surrounding his father's death. His father was connected with this emerging post-World War II technological scientific research structure that was existing in the intersection between the overt empire that was forming and a secret scientific apparatus, a black projects world that in some way interfaces with the UFO phenomenon. And so he's going to talk about how his dad actually was involved in that program and how he discovered his dad's journals as a teenager and first discovered this secret aspect of his dad's life. At the very end of this clip, he's going to talk about how his father was exposed to the creation of this underground imperial black projects apparatus that began to be built out after World War II. I talk about this in my book. But he and his peers that were being drawn into it, it was given the cover of a secret war with aliens or extraterrestrial presence. And I talk about this in the book, how that narrative seems to have been created by some secret, I call it the Technocratic Superstate, a scientific institution that is formed around etheric energy that blanketed itself or concealed itself in a layer of disinformation about aliens. But that disinformation campaign was not just targeted at the public, it was actually targeted towards the government and the military industrial complex and the aspects of what we call today the deep state that are oriented towards empire and domination and hegemony and global expansion. So the deeper entity that had access to the secret technology, they wanted to keep themselves secret, not just from the public, but from the imperial apparatus, and then use that apparatus to accomplish its own ends while keeping itself secret. That's the hypothesis and the theory that I explore in my book. So when his father writes about the government's secret war with extraterrestrials, this is part of a mythos that was introduced after World War II as part of an elaborate, basically psychological operation in order to conceal the true story, which involves the Kammerstab and the SS and World War II, and then earlier the flying airship societies in America, et cetera, et cetera. So just keep in mind that when we're hearing Adam Trombly's explanation or we're hearing about his dad's interpretation of this world that they're encountering, it's very much still an interpretation.
This is Spectrum.
Alternative medicine, homeopathy, secrets, society, hypnosis, the paranormal, alternative, energy, UFO, abduction, the real and the wonderful.
With your hosts, Tom Theophane and Scott Jordan.
Hello, good evening, and welcome to the Spectrum Radio Network on BBS Radio 2. I'm Scott Jordan. Hello, Adam. I think what I'd like to start with is just a bit of history about your life and what got you into where you are now.
Both my mother and my father were scientists. And basically, I was raised from the get-go as a scientist. My father was actually working on his PhD when I was born at Purdue University. And my mother was actually working still at that time as a medical technician in one of the labs at Purdue University. So I grew up in laboratories and sitting at microscopes. We used to joke that instead of being breastfed, we were microscope fed, basically, because that was the most nurturing position my mother ever could be found in. By the time I was 5, I could read proficiently. And if I had a question, my father would say, look it up.
Or go research it.
Yeah, so I'd go into the den library and I would grab the Britannica or I would grab some reference book and I would look it up. We didn't use the word water, it was H2O. It was extreme in some ways. It was science. But then my father was also involved in, famously at this point, involved in when he got recruited back into the United States Air Force. As he was completing his PhD, he was approached by a fellow 8th Army officer named Frank Olson. And Dr. Olson basically was a biochemist as well. And he was a fellow 8th Air Force individual who also was a Purdue alumnus. And he approached my father and said, we need you for this biological warfare program. It's highly compartmentalized. It'll be very restricted. You won't be able to communicate to family what you're doing, but you have a skill of strategic importance to the United States government, and you are still technically in the Air Force Reserves, and so we are calling you up. And so as soon as my father got his PhD, we moved to Frederick, Maryland, and he proceeded to work on this program. Of course, I was just a baby, and so I didn't really have any cognizance of what was going on. I had an eidetic memory, and so I remember, for example, Roscoe Hillenkoetter, who was the head of the CIA, and Frank Olson and people like that eating dinner at our house in Frederick, Maryland. The thing is that in 1967, on the 7th anniversary of my father's death, and again, that's a well-known, by some people anyway, it's a well-known story. He was actually injected with a virus that he had isolated at the biological warfare laboratories, and it was a retrovirus that causes a form of Hodgkin's lymphoma. And until 1967, on April 3rd, 1967, I found his journals buried in the mineral insulation of my mother's attic. When I was putting out mouse traps, I thought that he had died of natural causes. And
Did he write something in the journal that would
oh yeah, he wrote a lot in the journal. And he basically talked about how he knew that Frank Olson hadn't committed suicide, how he had filed an internal complaint for further investigation, and he was very angry that Frank Olson's death had been written off as a suicide because he didn't believe that Frank had jumped out of the window of the hotel in New York at all. And he was told that his pay grade was going to be increased. He was a postgraduate student. He was working on a postdoc in virology and bacteriology. And so they basically told him, we're going to give you this injection and then you can be allowed into a part of the lab that Frank was allowed into, but you haven't been allowed into yet. And he couldn't imagine what that was because he'd been exposed to so many, like he said to one of his dissertation advisors at Purdue was a guy named Dr. Quackenbush. His real name was Quackenbush. And in a letter that my father wrote to him that turned up in some of the documents that we were going through, he said he had a carbon copy of it that he had kept. And he said, there are things that have strained even my very vivid imagination. And this was just in his first 2 weeks at Dietrich. And it turned out the things that had strained his very vivid imagination had to do with a war that the people of the United States of America have been kept in the dark about. And that was trying to find a way to kill an alien species whose air superiority was obviously so great that they could run circles around anything we had, and they still can, by the way. And
so this was a biological, they were looking to kill them.
That's right. They were looking for some way to transfect.
Did your father date the journal entries?
Oh, yes, he did.
So
yeah.
When was he talking about the alien aspect?
He was talking about the alien aspect from the very beginning. So this is 1953. And then in January of 1954, he was injected. And again, he was told that this was a vaccination in preparation for the next level of security clearance. And instead what happened was he ran a very high fever for several days, 103 plus for several days. And they reduced him to a reader, which of course was not acceptable to him because he'd had the highest security clearance you can get. And he said, I'm not a GD reader. I'm not going to be an analyst. I'm not a reader. I'm a chemist. I'm a scientist. And he and a guy he was helped out because there was I wouldn't call it exactly a full-on rebellion, but it was a full-on rebellion. John Murphy, Captain Murphy, and Bob Harper. There were a number of guys who all moved en masse out to Park Forest, Illinois, which was the template for United States suburbia at the time. It was developed by a guy named Klutchnik, and there's a rather famous book about it that's in this, and a little display in the Smithsonian Museum of Science and Industry. There's a little shrine to my hometown where I grew up, Park Forest, Illinois.
Okay.
And basically it was like the highest concentration of PhDs in the world. And most of these guys were former military guys, almost all of them. And
working on secret projects.
And working on secret projects. My dad was a radar navigator in World War II on B-17s and had his first conscious experience with alien aircraft when he was flying in B-17 8th Air Force squadrons. And they used to call these craft Foo Fighters that flew in and out of the formations. And his life was saved by one day. Interesting to note, he was flying along. They just replaced the lead plane in the formation because the lead plane had been shot down. And when they replaced the lead plane, he was, like I said, he was a radar navigator. So on this mission, at this point, this very bright light traveling at speeds that were unimaginable at the time. You have to remember that the Germans had just come out with the first jet engines, Messerschmitt, and I think Fokker-Wulf also had a version, and they had a couple other weird little inventions like rocket planes and rocket gliders. And the Germans at that point were desperately scrambling to save their asses, and you can't blame them because we were bombing the living hell out of them. And so this thing there had been a radar problem with the electronics. And so he was sitting at the Northern Bomb Site in the front of the plane, which is a kind of a plexiglass dome. And this bright light came screaming towards the front, towards him. And as it approached the nose of the aircraft, he heard the words, "Harvey, jump." And he said it wasn't like there was any interpretive barrier. He just leapt out of the seat, which was bolted to the floor, of course. And this piece of shrapnel, flak shrapnel, came right up through the tube, blew the seat apart. He was injured by the shrapnel slightly, but his behind wasn't blown off.
Yeah,
And
but he got to live, yeah.
he got to live. And he said in the next few moments, which seemed, he said his exact word in his writing was, it seemed like an eternity, but I never got to converse with him about this because I discovered it 7 years after he had died, actually. But the fact is that he said that in those few moments afterwards, which seemed like an eternity, he's had this very intense, we would call it now a download. He didn't call it a download there. He called it an epiphany, that he was going to survive the war and that he was going to survive the war for a reason, and that he knew that he was going to die. But before he died, that he would have accomplished a couple things to set things in motion for the next step.
Right.
So right there in that end section is an example of what I'm talking about, how you can have different interpretations of what that experience that he had might have been. On one hand, you could interpret it as an extraterrestrial encounter, but you could also look at it as some type of spiritual experience or something maybe happened within his consciousness. There's a variety of other explanations if you expand your understanding of our world system beyond just the material level. And so that's, as a philosopher, that's where I go with these things. Is I always try to understand that beyond all these particular events is a underlying field of unity. And so the extraterrestrial hypothesis violates that concept of unity because it creates an other and it writes off the existence of an underlying substrate that binds everything together, and from out of which and back into which all things come and go in the course of moving into and out of embodiment. So in the next section, Adam Trombly is going to go into his adolescence and talk about some of the unique and peculiar aspects of his childhood that ended up coming out. Like he was a kind of a genius and a savant. And he also references being a part of a government program for high-performing youth. I think he calls it Star Child. So we're going to hear about his adolescence coming up.
So you can imagine me, young Republican, sitting reading this at the age of 15 and precocious and kind of a weird kid in some ways. Not weird in any kind of terrible way, but I was geeky and interested in stuff. It wasn't so much about school as it was about just I started writing papers in astrophysics when I was in my teens and about quasi-stellar objects. And
Didn't they give you an IQ test, or did that come later?
No, it actually came when I transferred from a Catholic grade school to a public grade school. And the reason my father, before he died, pulled me out of the Catholic grade school was because they said I was learning challenged. I was learning disabled, actually. And he said, nonsense, he's been reading since he's 4.5. Of course, my sister taught me how to read, but it wasn't just like I just sat down and picked up a book and started reading. But the thing is that he knew it was BS. And so they gave me a battery of tests to find out if I needed to be in that special section. And basically, they gave me a test and I scored anomalously high on that test. And then they gave me a second test, assuming that it was going to come out much worse. And instead it came out even better. And then they gave me a third test. And
the third test you didn't want to do, you were like...
And the third test was like, I said at the third test, why? I'm not retarded. I don't care what anybody says. And they said, no, we know you're not retarded. And then Mrs. Craigle, my third grade teacher, came over and sat at the kitchen table with my mother, and I was asked to leave the room. But of course, as all children will do, I hovered at the end of the hallway, which was across the dining room from the kitchen, and eavesdropped on the conversation. And she was first saying, we don't know what to do with him. The school is really not equipped to handle anybody with his IQ. And my mother said, really? Is it that bad? And my third grade teacher, who was just, I still remember her face really clearly. She was really beautiful. She goes, no, it's just the opposite. We don't know how to relate to him even. And he should really be in a private school where he's being related to in a way a manner that's appropriate for his IQ.
Do you remember the numbers?
But yeah, I don't talk about the numbers.
Yeah, okay.
So when I discovered my father's notes, going back to 1967, it was, for me, it was this moment where it was like, it was such a shock to my system to read my own father's words about these things, and that they weren't like goofy science fiction, and that he was really deeply troubled by this contradiction of the United States government and Eisenhower's decision not to talk to the public about it, and Truman's before him, and the fight between Vandenberg and Hillenkoetter, because Hillenkoetter really felt like we should go to the public, and then he was replaced by Dulles. And of course, that was what my father called a catastrophe to the culture of Central Intelligence. He was not a big fan of Dulles. But from my perspective, at this stage of my life, the dilemma he was dealing with goes all the way back to the turn of the century with Nikola Tesla as well. But his dilemma was that, and he knew Forrestal, and he knew that Forrestal had been murdered. He knew Frank Olson had been murdered. He knew Forrestal wanted to go public about aliens. And it was just like there's this group of people who basically, they kind of have a plutocracy going on.
I mean, this must be hitting you like a ton of bricks. You're reading your dad's secret journals that he had hid away that you found after he had died. And did he have any thoughts about why they wanted to keep this information secret? Or did he was just miffed by it?
No, he actually did have an idea of why they were keeping it secret. He knew what the arguments were, and basically they were elitist arguments. They were arguments that the human species wasn't prepared. It would cause a special ontological crisis, like an existential crisis would occur. And it was about control, in his opinion, more than anything else, that it would become much harder to control things. He was confronted with this fact that these guys knew early on that there were abductions happening. They knew early on that this was occurring, and this was seen as a vector for infection, for transfection. And he knew all the way back we're talking about 1952, 1953, 1954, he knew. And Hillenkoetter knew. And it was like, okay, who are these beings? They knew that there was more than one kind. But the thing that he said that was so interesting was, he said, I think that the primary reason this is being kept from the public isn't because they feel like it's going to create an ontological crisis because there are aliens, quote unquote. He said, I think it's because then we would have to talk about the superior physics demonstrated by their craft, and that absolutely do not depend on any of the physics that we teach at any of our universities in the world. And that's really the crux of it. So my father saw this. My father saw that there were people who wanted to exploit the fact that we had captured enough in the wreckage, not just from Roswell, but from a couple other incidents that are not even publicly known, basically, that we had captured enough of this technology to try to reverse engineer it, and that it wasn't just about superior technology in terms of physical, generative, or flying technology. It was also about a much superior evolutionary state of being. Not necessarily because the concentration of brain mass was that much greater, but because the integration of brain mass was that much greater.
So it's not just a nuts and bolts UFO story.
Exactly, right. And so he was divided. He was in his own mind in a quandary about this, and he had a problem with this whole thing. And he also knew that this post-World War II Central Intelligence Group, they basically were integrated into an understanding of this kind of cult of science, a Teutonic thing that went on in Nazi Germany. And they had a castle, and they had this place where they studied, and they brought these guys in to understand about the fact that there was this Nordic kind of alien species that they were talking to, and tried to develop craft. Schauberger was involved in the program. There were a number of different people who were involved in the program at that time.
It's called the Vril program, VRIL. Yeah. And the other group was called the Tula, and they were more the Thula or Tula, and they were more into the esoteric occult aspect.
Yeah, they were, yeah. And Andrei Puharich was one of the main people who interfaced on that, along with Frank. And of course, Andrei Puharich went off into the psychic warfare development issues and began doing that in the early 1950s. And all the things he did in Maine initially, and then later in Ossining in New York, experimenting on inmates at Sing Sing. with lysergic acid, diethylamide 25, and other things, and studying psychic phenomena, and actually creating a catalog of children who were primarily initially the children of people who worked for the United States government on classified programs, which is how we got integrated into it. And Puharich, he was an extraordinarily talented hypnotist and abused that sometimes, I might say. But the fact of the matter is, at that time in the early 50s, he basically would hypnotize children. We would be taken to Bethesda by our mothers. And
So are you saying you were part of that program?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Okay.
For sure, yeah. It was called the Star Child Program, and Andrei Puharich was in charge of it. But the fact of the matter is that he had a catalog, and basically what would happen under hypnosis is these children, I'm talking about 2-year-old, 3-year-old children sometimes.
Do you remember how old you were when you started?
2.
Okay.
And basically in the process, these children would say things about where they came from. That, oh, I didn't come from this planet. This is little kids who have absolutely no frame of reference at all. No way that they could have achieved a frame of reference even in terms of acquiring information. They didn't have those acquisition skills, let alone any kind of exposure.
That sort of backs up what another guest of ours said. We had a guest on just recently about reincarnation, and he said right up to the age of 7, children are working on the template of what they've done previously in previous lives.
All right, there's a lot to unpack in that passage. Towards the middle of it, he said the part that I think is the key, which is that in his father's journals, he opined that the reason for the secrecy was actually to conceal the physics and the technology. By implication, everything on top of that is a type of excuse or disinformation campaign or some other misdirection designed to conceal that fundamental truth. So in the next section, he's going to talk about the situation within the military-industrial complex during the 1950s that his father wrote about in his journals. And some of this has to do with a civil war taking place within certain deep state institutions. And that dynamic is very tightly interfaced with the UFO mystery and secret physics, secret science, and the desire of the powers that be to basically keep all that secret and create a parallel governance institution in charge of it. And so that's, again, interfacing with the story of the Technocratic Superstate that I talk about in my book. But let's jump right back into Adam Trombly's narrative, and let's continue.
Literally, right after, not long after I was born, we go off to Frederick, Maryland. My father's involved in this biological warfare program. We have the head of the CIA eating dinner in our house. We have Vandenberg and Hillenkoetter at each other's throats half the time because Vandenberg wanted to control it because it was about the control of airspace from his perspective. Hillenkoetter wanted to control it because it was about intelligence as far as he was concerned. And Truman had actually been the one, before he was no longer in charge, Truman was actually the one who basically said, no, we're going to make this a joint program between the United States Air Force and the Central Intelligence Agency. So Truman's the actual guy who created that. It was a brilliant political move because he saw no other way to resolve it. My father was aware of all this. My father was aware that when Forrestal wanted to go public about the whole presence of aliens and the Roswell and other incidents, that he was put into watch over at Bethesda. And basically, they said that he hung himself out the window. And my father didn't believe for a second that Forrestal had killed himself, any more than he believed that Frank Olson had. My father was totally freaked out by this. Because in the first place, Forrestal gets murdered, and then his good friend and colleague, Frank Olson, gets murdered. And they both have integration into both aspects of these programs, the Thule program as well. And it wasn't just the Brill, but it was also the Thule program. They knew about this stuff. And my father's best friend when he died was a former SS officer, strange to say. And, and then his colleagues started to be taken out. Bob Harper was taken out suddenly, and another one of his colleagues spontaneously combusted sitting in his easy chair. There were just weird things that happened. And, of course, this meant that there was this kind of unusual kind of surveillance, you could call it, of certain lives that certain people had.
So when you had read all this,
I was blown away. I was astonished. I was blown away. And it made total sense to me in a certain sense. But it caused a total ontological and epistemological crisis in my life. It was a total meltdown that I went through. And it was quickly resolved experientially by an epiphany that occurred within the first 24 hours or so of me discovering these notes and reading them. It wasn't just a discovery. It's probably 3 days after I discovered them when I think about it. But I went through this kind of passage, well, a dark moment of the soul. I wouldn't call it a dark night of the soul because it wasn't a prolonged event. And felt thereafter much more integrated into life, and also at the same time rather frustrated because there was no one I could talk to. I talked to Thomas Merton about it as a confessor. I actually went to Gethsemane in Kentucky where he was before he left on his Oriental voyage, which he never returned from. And he was the first person I confided in about this.
So what he's talking about here gives us extremely valuable information about what was happening within the U.S. national security state in the decade or so after World War II. And he clearly makes reference that there was a operation that I talk about in my book. There was an operation that took place in which America harvested the Nazi Germany Black Projects program. So that's one program that his dad and his colleagues knew about, and they were also interfacing with what seems to be sold as a domestic program that was interfacing with crash saucers like Roswell and with reverse engineering them. So these are the two things that they're aware of. Now, this is not exactly in alignment with my own theory about it, but we've already talked about that and I won't go back through it. But looking back at his father's journals, this is what he was aware of. And that ostensibly was too much knowledge for him and his colleagues to have because one by one they were all taken out. And they also seem to have not been totally on board with the move to basically create a parallel governance institution. They wanted to go public about what they perceived as this alien thing and also with the technologies. And so that could also explain away why they were taken out one by one. But certainly they knew too much information given what the motion was moving towards in terms of creating a secret scientific substructure within the military-industrial complex. So what Trombly gives us here is extremely rare and invaluable insight into the culture of this world. That said, let's move on now into the beginning and development of Adam Trombly's own career. So let's jump back into the interview.
I began to have these insights that I had to keep very quiet about because as I was going through the process of my education, never confided in any of my professors except for Bucky.
Buckminster Fuller.
And Buckminster Fuller was the next person after Thomas Merton, and I met him not long after, actually, almost the same time.
So synchronicity after these events, synchronicity pushed your life forward into meeting the sort of people that you needed to meet to do what you need to do from then on. Because now we're moving into your free energy.
Yeah, it was like there's this, I call it choreography of my life that I began to become conscious of. In retrospect, I realized that it had been going on the whole time, including my father's death, strange to say. And that there was this choreography going on. A guy at Crockenberg bookstore in Chicago, a gal at the University of Chicago Lab School Library, and another woman at another library at the public school that I went to as well. The more that we avail ourselves to the intrinsic awareness and the intrinsic intelligence of existence itself, the more we open ourselves to that, the more you understand that consciousness is intrinsic to the process. It isn't a byproduct of neurochemistry. And the scientific materialists would have us isolate our brains and say, oh, the whole thing, all your emotions and all this stuff is just biochemistry in your brain, neurochemistry. It's, of course, nonsense because consciousness itself is intrinsic. But again, that's leaping pretty far ahead here in the conversation.
Yeah.
When I met Fuller, it was some friends and I actually were sitting and we were talking and we decided to drive down to Carbondale to see Bucky Fuller talk. We went down and we actually got there half an hour after it started, and there were some seats close to the front that were still open, so we walked right up to the front. And he went on and talked until 1 something in the morning. And by the time he stopped, there were 8 of us left in the auditorium. And he'd given everybody permission to leave on 3 or 4 different occasions. He says, please feel at any time where you have reached your capacity. I don't want you to be overwhelmed. And he says, you completely don't have to stand on any kind of politic here. You can leave and don't be embarrassed. And some people did. And obviously people who were there were used to being able to do this because he went on and on. because he was a comprehensivist. He was not a specialist. He was
Right.
he was somebody who appreciated the power of the brain very differently than anybody I knew. And like I said, I was surrounded by PhDs and MDs and accomplished people from a conventional perspective who still only used a small percentage of their brains. Bucky, on the other hand, was this kind of renegade guy out there who'd been kicked out of Harvard twice, and et cetera, and who was the head of the design department at a state school called Southern Illinois University at Carbondale. And it was the most exciting thing I'd ever heard in my life in terms of a presentation being given by an academic. And I'd heard a lot of them by that point. And I think I was 17 at the time. I was 16 at the time, 16. I was 16 at the time. I was almost 17 at the time.
Just the fact that you can say I was 16 going on 17 or 17 years old and I had heard a lot of academic lectures, that's unusual all by itself.
Yeah, my mother dated, a couple years after my father died, my mother dated the head of paleontology at the Field Museum. So I was like the young prince of the paleontology section. I could go wherever I wanted to go and hold dinosaur bones and saber-toothed tiger skulls. And this is a guy who'd gone off in search of the Yeti and came back with scientific evidence for its reality and was completely convinced of it. And then he got hit with the invisible wall.
The academic stick.
And it's so funny. I have so much experience with this, and in my life, my sister made major breakthrough in cancer research and was unable to basically get her message across exactly. She actually delivered a paper that made the statement of this discovery, even though it contradicted 8 of the top people, including her own boss. Her own paper contradicted them, and so therefore they made her keep redoing these experiments. Now it's part of the common knowledge of molecular biophysics and physics and molecular biology. Everybody knows what she was saying back then that was so controversial is true, and this is what happens. This is normal, and this is the moment of inertia we get.
So listening to Bucky was not normal.
People run things, yes. But listening to Bucky was such a breath of fresh air.
Now that we've gone a bit further into analyzing Adam Trombly's unusual coming-of-age story and what his influences were that shaped how he learned how to think and process information, all that stuff would go into his later career as an inventor. Next, we're going to go into another aspect of his life, going beyond just his work as a physicist and engineer. He had another interesting parallel experience with this guy named John C. Lilly, who was a kind of another savant genius type, who was really into analyzing the nervous system and the mysteries of consciousness, and he was a very shamanistic type of figure. Adam Trombly as well. And they're going to talk about how, in the process of developing a technology that they were using for a different purpose that had to do with measuring wavelengths, electromagnetic wavelengths, that they picked up on a signal that was ambient within our electrical system that suggests that a deeper technological entity is using the electrical system to engineer the subconscious.
We look at this whole situation as it is right now, and we see this kind of headless horseman syndrome. We see a body acting without intelligence, running around destroying rainforests, running around polluting and poisoning the water and the air, and putting fluoride into the water, which makes people docile, which was used in Auschwitz to make people docile, impotent, and sterile. Okay, it's a poison, for Christ's sakes. It has the skull and crossbones all over the container for a reason, because fluoride's a really significant poison. But we do all these things. There's so much. I recently gave an interview with Catherine Austin Fitz at Solari at Coast to Coast, and basically we talked a lot about entrainment, and what you just brought up, of course, is regarding that. Alpha entrainment was used at Nuremberg Stadium and over all the broadcast media in Germany.
Now, when you say alpha training, what do you mean by alpha training?
Alpha entrainment. It means there's a mechanism in the human neurophysiology called frequency following response, and it goes back as far as we can look back. I've been in very primitive situations in Africa and in Brazil in particular, where even people living in relatively primitive states in the middle of a jungle, I'm talking about primitive states in terms of technological development, etc. No technological development except for fire, basically, and pointy sticks making a compound and hammocks in Brazil. But these people, basically, with that kind of environment, had rhythms, they had music, they had patterns they repeated ritualistically. And that ritual repetition is the earliest form, and those repeating rhythms are the earliest form of entrainment, are the earliest form of group entrainment. And frequency following response is the response of the brain to, whether it's through the optical pathway or through the oral pathway of hearing, aural, A-U-R-A-L. Basically, the brain will go into a certain kind of rhythm following a rhythm that you're hearing repeated to you over and over again. One of the reasons some of the rhythms that are in music sometimes are actually pathogenic. There's a lot of stuff that's on the radio that's actually pathogenic. It's imbalancing. It actually creates severe neural deficits. It locks people into...
And would this also include television shows?
Oh, of course it includes television shows. But so what happened was that that this was discovered in Germany, actually before it was in the late 20s, and there were certain frequencies that they began to experiment with, certain tones that they began to experiment with to see which tones, which frequencies would induce what kind of states. And so when Nuremberg Stadium was designed by Albert Speer, the architect, it was acoustically designed as well as all the other aspects. And they broadcast alpha entrainment. So people's nervous systems were soothed. They were put into, some people think that alpha entrainment is all about a meditative state, but it's actually a suggestible state as much as anything else. When you're using it in this kind of environment, it can make you feel like Barack Obama is a savior. It made them feel like Hitler was a savior, for Christ's sakes. And am I drawing a comparison? Yes, I am actually drawing a comparison, but not between the two individuals, but between the fact that Adolf Hitler was the first political figure whose rise to power was aided by frequency following response, and whose sustenance in power was aided by frequency following response, because not only in Nuremberg Stadium were these things broadcast, but over the radio networks these were broadcast. And you have to remember, this is all monaural back then, so we didn't have the ability that we have now with binaural and surround sound, which is quite amazing. Some of the waveforms that we are now getting entrained to are quite sophisticated, and there's no way they're not intentional, because there's no way that those things are naturally occurring. John Lilly, I frequently refer to, was visiting us here in Aspen in 1990. Actually, he was staying at one of the buildings, the first office building it was a tiny little building for the Institute for Advanced Studies. And he was up and he climbed down the ladder from the loft. It was a sleeping loft, actually. And he climbed down the ladder, and I had just seated myself at my desk, and I just turned on the spectrum analyzer, the signal analyzer that was sitting by my desk at the time, an old Hewlett-Packard 3561A. And as this device warmed up, it was hooked up into the neutral and the ground, because we'd realized that because we have what we call an open neutral loop in the United States grid, that we could utilize the entire grid, the neutral loop in the grid, as an antenna, as a giant antenna. Before that, we had gone to some considerable expense, $200,000, to have 24,000 miles of wire wound. And one of my colleagues, who was very adept, he was actually an operating engineer, as well as being one of the most brilliant engineers I've ever met to this date, without exception. But he primarily dug the hole. I think I got on the backhoe and made a couple cuts, but we buried 24,000 miles worth of wire in a hoop outside of Pendleton, Oregon, on an Indian reservation there, where his wife was from that tribe. And we thought it might help us be more free from federal interference. It didn't exactly turn out that way. But the fact is that we were trying to measure Earth resonances, and we were trying to analyze these signals. And one day we realized that we could just hook into the neutral and the ground, and we could accomplish the same thing, but with even a greater, a really huge antenna. As long as we could see beyond the noise, and we learned how to do that. But so in the process of this thing warming up, there was this waveform that appeared. And if you looked at the spectrum, it started at DC and it ended at 100 kilohertz as the thing was warming up, going through its boot up process. You have to remember, at this stage of the game, it is like an antique. But at that stage of the game, it was almost a brand new instrument. And so there's this waveform that appeared, and it had about a 2-volt swing. And that means that the hump went up 2 volts on both sides of the wave. And then there's this hump in the wave, and then there's this pause, and then there's a dip in the wave, and then there's this pause and a hump in the wave, et cetera, the two reversing. And then he looked at this and he says, where's that waveform coming from? What's generating that waveform? And I said, that's something that's just ambient on the grid. He says, what, the power grid? And I said, the power grid. And he said, what's it doing on the power grid? Is this just at your house, or is this really everywhere? And I said, no, we've measured it in several different locations in different states as well. We've seen this same thing every time we start up this instrument. I figured it was an artifact of the internal electronics of the machine. He says, no. He says, I invented that wave. It's called the Lilly wave. I invented that wave. I invented that waveform when I was working with the National Institutes for Mental Health. I invented that waveform when we were on Navy contract, we were implanting dolphin brains. And we discovered that when we tried to induce sine waves into a dolphin brain, that they would go into epileptic seizures. And because I had a very close relationship with these dolphins, of course, I couldn't torment them or torture them. So I had to find a way that we could induce different kind of submissive states or instructional states without causing them to go into epileptic seizures. So he says, so I invented this wave, and he says, and you see how he says, can you pause this? So I paused it, and he says, so here's the rise. Anybody can Google the Lilly wave, by the way, and you'll see a little Lilly wave site will come up. And basically he says, so here's the stimulation here, and here's the pause. And the pause is the response vector pause, is what I call it. He says, because this allows all of those synapses to fire and for there to be a response without feedback happening and having them get overwhelmed and go into seizure states. And I said, oh, that's fascinating. And he says, so this is a mind control waveform. He says, can you blow up the wave more? Can you magnify the wave more? He says, of course I can. So I made it just the primary window, because it's a split window at that point. I made it a primary window. I blew it up. He says, oh, yeah, see? He said, so they have this primary Lilly wave intermodulated with all kinds of other stuff. He says, those fuckers. He said, pardon my language. He says, I can't believe they're doing this. He says, this is what they did with my research. He says, I knew they were going to do something like this. He says, I just knew it. And John was from one of the most prominent families in Minnesota. His brother's in the Fed governing body and the Federal Reserve and blah, 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 all that stuff. Wasn't from a normal family. His father owned Northwest Airlines, etc.
So an elite family.
Yeah, and he was wealthy and basically not dependent on other people for his funding. So he could do whatever the F he wanted to do. And he was an MD, and he was extraordinary when it came to neurophysiology and psychiatry and stuff like that, and psychology, but especially neurophysiology. And he was really into cetacean research, of course, and interspecial communication. And that's a whole other subject. I could talk for hours and hours just about John's work. But that moment for me was such an illumination, because I had absolutely no idea what this waveform was, none whatsoever. It didn't even ever occur to me that this was a mind control waveform, and that this is why it was on the grid. This is why it's on the power grid. And it's in everybody's home, in everybody's harness. It's in Canada, it's in the United States. It is not universally present, because not everybody has the same thing, but it is more and more present in the world. It's a form of electromagnetic entrainment, which is another vector of entrainment. And the primary vector of entrainment, of course, is from, I shouldn't say of course, but the primary vector of entrainment electromagnetically is the water molecule. And the water molecule can respond to extremely weak, what we call femtotesla, extremely weak magnetic signals. And this is one of the things that we have to be aware of. And when HARP comes into play and all these things, this is the vector of entrainment that's primarily being used in coordination with mass rally events like the Super Bowl.
Okay.
The Super Bowl is a huge, massive entrainment event. The World Cup for soccer is a huge, massive global entrainment event where people are actually being synced up and enter into a kind of psychophysical entanglement as a result. And certain kinds of neurochemical states are being intentionally introduced. And this isn't, I'm not talking about the president of some news network knowing that this is what's happening. I'm not even talking about the president of the United States necessarily knowing everything about what's happening. I'm not sure how much Barack Obama knew and how much he didn't know about how much entrainment was being used during his campaign. We'd never seen more sophisticated entrainment, is all I can say. And we'd seen the Republican Party using entrainment for quite a long time, for decades. But we'd never really seen a real sophisticated use of it in the Democratic Party side of things. And with Barack Obama, that changed. And we saw the most sophisticated we've ever seen. We had a whole stadium in Oregon when Barack Obama gave a presentation up there, gave a speech up there, who were like people who were religious converts. And this is, of course, what happened with Hitler over and over again with audiences back then. Again, this is to draw a focus on the technology and not necessarily to say that Barack Hussein Obama is something like Adolf Hitler as a person. Okay?
You're just talking about the technology that's being used.
I'm talking about the technology that's being used and the fact that almost every statement he made was disingenuous, notwithstanding. Okay, Barack Obama, I was told by somebody who worked for a very famous newspaper that I should change my attitude because I was early on promoting him back in 2004. And basically, he told me, you don't know the whole story here. And this is before we discovered any of the other stuff. So the fact is that what we need to do is we need to have an understanding that there's a reason why people are passive. There's a reason why people are not responsive on a level of intelligence which is necessary for our own survival as a species. Somebody from Bank of America was just testifying for Congress the other day. They have a patent on a technology that actually in the process of a phone call can change your mood about interacting with the Bank of America. They actually have a patent on the technology. This is how brazen this is. This is something that technically is against the law, and yet they have a patent. We live in a world where very sophisticated technologies are being used to manipulate people. And they're being used primarily by the global corporate hegemony. And this beast actually exists as a kind of supraneural electronically integrated network. And this electronically integrated network can change your body chemistry at will.
Okay, in that section, Trombly gave us another very valuable bit of information that helps us uncover more about what this hidden underground black project's secret scientific, technological, classified apparatus, how it works, what kind of things it's involved in. The general theme is using science and technology explicitly as a form of governance, but it's not able to integrate this new approach or these new discoveries and inventions and innovations. It's not able to implement them coherently into the overall whole of society because it's operating in a position of secrecy. And also in the position that it's infused with this drive for empire. And so the psychology of empire colors the way our technology has developed and the way it's being expressed. I mean, ostensibly, you could use, as he mentioned here, you could use entrainment for not just negative purposes, but positive ones as well. I mean, some people use entrainment in the form of hemisync, which is a meditational technology. So there's ways that you can use it positively, but in this sense, he's describing a use of it that's similar to how the Nazis used it, which was for making people docile. And it's not surprising that the Americans would adopt that Nazi technique because the Americans harvested the Nazi Black Project's science program. In the next passage, he's going to talk about how this Black Project's entity can make the decision to basically shut you down and take all your stuff. And he talks about having confronted this in two forms with the research that he was doing with free energy or etheric energy, but also with this entrainment technology that he's talking about in this passage. He had a device that he could measure these things, and he could measure what this mass engineering technology was doing. So as a consequence, it moved in and took all its stuff. So he's going to talk about that aspect of this dynamic as well coming up.
This system, they're broadcasting it over HARP, which is only one of those kind of broadcast units in the world. There's several of them around the world at this point. And that's a huge subject in and of itself. And we analyzed those signals, and when I went public with the results of our analysis and the little thing I published on the internet back in 1994. It was 10 days, I think, later or something like that when we got raided. Even though they used the excuse of one of my colleagues' activities to validate and justify the warrant and all those things. They came and confiscated everything, basically because this was the equipment that was allowing us to see what was really going on with HARP. And this is not just in terms of normal transverse communication, transverse wave communication, which is normal electromagnetic communication, but also in terms of scalar transition wave communication. We were able to see it and we were able to see what was going on to a certain degree. It was so overwhelming. It had one of my colleagues in tears. He called me, he says, "You got to fly to Oregon so you can see this." I sat down, and when I saw it, I was astonished. It's too much to get into all of it in the context of this interview, but I was astonished, just astonished. And because it indicated a level of sophistication which hardly seemed human, in addition to a level of sophistication which made conspiracy theorists look like amateurs, look like nutcases, not because they were wrong, but because they were so unsophisticated. Now, whose agenda could that be? Okay? Whose agenda is that? And so this is the kind of thing that we have to ask ourselves. We have to ask, as we said before, who is it that's doing this? And it's one thing to say it's a corporate hegemony. That's a convenient grab bag statement that I make sometimes too frequently, I think. It's because it's much more sophisticated than that. The level of technology, when David Farnsworth and I were first monitoring, when he was first monitoring and called me to see what we were monitoring up in Oregon, what he was monitoring, because I hadn't seen it yet, and I saw all of this amazing stuff, intermodulated Lilly waves and double helix broadcasts going on that looked like chromosomes with genes coming off of them, that were marching across our screens as we were receiving this data from HAARP. It was like, what? This is a biological weapon that's being used.
Biological in what way?
You can
You
manipulate.
mean affect DNA?
Yeah, you can change people's waveforms, brain patterns. You can literally change people's state of mind. There's a level of sophistication that is so far beyond the comprehension of the general public because the general public has been systematically undereducated. I've never been successfully integrated into any government program for any period of time, even though I've been utilized and exploited, and Nikola Tesla even, in the exploitation of some of his technologies, which of course became HAARP with the ionospheric heater, following on his tower technology, which in 1904, in a New York Times article, on the front page of the New York Times, Nikola Tesla talked about a global network of information transfer where electrical power, literally, because he had patented the means to communicate electrical power without wires by that time. He could generate electrical power without fuel by that time, without wind, without solar. He could generate electrical power. So he could inductively couple into the Earth's resonant magnetic domain field. He could generate electrical power by doing so. In other words, harnessing the power of lightning. And so who is it that's doing this? Basically, the global economy was being taken over by the global corporate hegemony. And they were utilizing these incredibly sophisticated technologies that now look to me like caveman stuff, basically, because I've been involved with computers since punch cards. So it's like what we can do now, what I have sitting in front of me on this desk talking to you, is enormously sophisticated technology. And these enormously sophisticated technologies are being exploited by a cadre of scientists and technicians who basically are the army, the techno army for the corporate hegemony, and lack a moral compass too often. Not always. I've seen a lot of people burn out. I've seen a lot of people who talk to me about stuff over the years. As I lecture around the world, they'll come forward and they'll say, "Can I talk to you?" And I'll sit down, and I always agree never to reveal their identity.
I was going to say, it's always off the record, isn't it?
Well, it has to be, because these guys are telling me stuff that there's certain kind of test criteria that I have over the years, because I've also been approached by people who are intentionally trying to spread disinformation and people who are just nutcases as well. And so you have to learn a sense of verity. You have to learn a sense of whether or not somebody is actually communicating something that's true. And in spite of all of our programming, the word UFO triggers this entire response that's programmed into everybody. It's so sophisticated. I mean, to consider the level of sophistication in terms of mind control sophistication that was required in Arizona in 1997 in March of 1997, when the Phoenix Light incident happened. Consider that literally hundreds of thousands of people saw a giant craft from Prescott, Arizona, all the way down through Nogales on the border with Mexico, and probably beyond that into Mexico. But we know for a fact that tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people saw it. We know that they had different subjective interpretations of it. Some people recognized and were able to provide videotapes that indicated that it was over a mile across, that it moved across the sky utterly silently at a very slow speed, which of course was aerodynamically impossible. It would have fallen out of the sky if it had been a conventional aircraft. And yet, somehow or other, when Fife Symington lied about it under pressure from the Air Force, he claims now, and other entities, and people were told that it was just flares being sent up from Goldwater Air Force Base, it would have made Bucky's stomach turn, but it would have made Barry Goldwater, who was also a good friend of mine, it would have made his stomach turn because he was very read in terms of UFO phenomena. And I had amazing conversations with him about UFO phenomena from a very young age, basically. He was a remarkable guy and very maligned by his own party, ultimately, because he was a real genuine American conservative in the best sense of the word, not this weird perversion of it that's occurred. And it's dreadful what's occurred. We basically surrendered to the corporate hegemony. We're now under the tyranny of multinational corporations. What Bucky called the grunch of giants, the grand universal cash heist, is what grunch means.
Okay.
That's the acronym for Grand Universal Cash Heist. And basically, trillions and trillions, as our dear friend Catherine Austin Fitts has pointed out very vocally since she was Undersecretary of Housing and Urban Development for the United States government under the under the Bush administration, excuse me. And Jack Kemp was, of course, the head of it at that time in terms of HUD, in terms of Housing and Urban Development. But she discovered all this money being stolen in this cash heist. And we've just had this enormous global cash heist that's occurred through the central banks, not just in the United States, but globally.
And keeps occurring.
And demonstrated by the fact that Strauss-Kahn could brutally rape somebody to the point where she was physically, brutally injured. And her credibility was what comes into question instead of his. And because he was the former head of the IMF, which is, of course, it's organized crime. As Catherine Fitts has pointed out, and as I absolutely have to say, we all need to be aware of. Everybody needs to be aware of these things.
In the next section, Adam Trump is going to talk about the perversion of science and how there was a systematic rewriting of the doctrines of physics. So basically they created a public version of physics and a classified version of physics. And he's going to be delving into a bit of that. I talk about that a lot in my book.
You know, one of the primary things we learned from the first homopolar generator experiments was that a fundamental law that we had all been taught in science, the law of induction, was fundamentally flawed because the law of induction is V cross B, which indicates that in order to generate a current, there has to be relative motion between a conductor and a magnetic field carrier, whichever one is moving, whether it's the magnetic field carrier or the conductor. In other words, in a homopolar generator, which is one of the simplest, if not the simplest form, Michael Faraday discovered the first unipolar generator before it was called a homopolar generator because that was just a magnet on one side of the disk in December of 1831. He did an experiment which showed clearly that if you rotated the disk in the magnetic field, the rotor disk in the magnetic field, this is a copper disk with a magnet hanging over it, that you could get that primitive instrument voltmeter, the needle would get deflected a certain amount. And then he cemented a cylindrical magnet to the axis of rotation of that copper disc and put a paper insulator in between the two. And the needle was still deflected. So there was no relative motion, is what I'm saying, between the magnetic field carrier and the conductor, which is a fundamental contradiction to the law of induction. Lenz and Thering in the 1920s pointed out this contradiction. They also pointed out that Albert Einstein, who was becoming rapidly a kind of demagogue at the time, that Albert Einstein precious little dealt with the issue of rotation. And so Lenz and Thering came up with a very sophisticated idea of the dragging of inertial frames of reference with rotating objects using the unipolar and then the homopolar generator as an example. But this all gets buried and doesn't get taught to students. This fundamental experiment was left out. It was actually, it was rediscovered. One of the groups that autonomously rediscovered it was up in Canada. A group of high school instructors rediscovered the unipolar generator and thought they had invented a new kind of generator. This is how thoroughly this has been kept out of the literature.
Wow.
And when he elaborated on the law of induction, which is actually printed in his first book, called Experiments in Electricity and Magnetism. It's actually printed there. This isn't like some hypothetical thing. And we went to Stanford Rare Books back in the early research of our first generator. I would go down to Stanford quite a bit and basically discovered that there was this, actually they had a facsimile of his original handwritten diaries of that time. And I, of course, made copies of that and brought it back up, and much to the chagrin of one of my colleagues who said, that's impossible. All the equations say it's impossible. And it's right here. I said, right here, 1831. It's been there since 1831, before all the rest of this garbage got laid on top of it. So data acquisition, again, comes into play. This is data that Michael Faraday acquired that got integrated into his early publications, but was carefully edited out as time went on, because the stuff that gets edited out is the stuff that is not convenient for the global hegemony.
All right, in this next section, Trombly is going to talk about how he was assigned a handler early on as he started making his initial waves of progress in his research and experimentation into developing a Tesla-like energy power generation device that taps into the ether. So he was assigned a handler. He's going to talk about that. And he's also going to talk about other figures in the field, including Tesla, who are also working in this domain of etheric energy, and how they similarly had their own encounters with this invisible governance entity who basically shut it all down and defines the terms of the scientific research in this field and basically make sure that none of this ever goes mainstream. So he's going to talk about that in this next clip.
I came up in the computer industry and got out of it at a certain point, but I met Adolescence. I met all these different people. Jobs, Gates came to our booth at Comdex in 1983 and asked really good questions. We had an integrated interface, a front end to Unix that was quite sophisticated and could integrate word processing with spreadsheets. Nobody else in the world had anything like that at the time. That was on that level of sophistication. We got good write-ups in computer world and info world, stuff like that. But it was like I also discovered that the chairman of the board of the company was an intelligence agent who was assigned to me. He was my handler. I was told, don't you dare ever tell anybody this, after he just confessed it to me. But it's like bullshit. He said that if I didn't cooperate, my life would be, pardon my language, but it was that my life would be a living hell. And
was this when you were, because you built multiple units?
No, this is just after the first one. I met this particular individual at the first International Conference on Novel Energy Technologies at the University of Toronto in 1981. And it was actually the first time I'd received a standing ovation to a presentation. So I was young. I was just barely 30, and I was greeted by a lot of people as I left the auditorium at the university. And basically, this is one of the guys who approached me.
So you were talking about computer technology, or you were talking about a free energy device?
He approached me about my speech, just like everybody else was. There was an old detective, retired detective from New York City, who had come up to this conference, who told me that he knew Nikola Tesla had been murdered because it was his first case that he worked on as a young detective after he'd just gotten his gold shield. And he was quite a character and left an indelible memory in my nervous system, which has survived many traumas. But the fact is that this is just another one of those infiltrations into my life, of which there have been many, actually. Because there's a few of us who've been loose cannons. Bruce De Palma was a loose cannon. He was a guy who was Egerton's assistant at MIT in terms of Schlieren photography, which is stroboscopic, high-frequency stroboscopic photography where you can see things. In those days, it was very sophisticated. And then Bruce started doing some experiments with what he called the N machine, which was basically a homopolar generator, which he didn't know about. He really thought that this was it. He had discovered this. He really believed it sincerely. He wasn't a liar. He believed it. But he was a very bright man, Bruce.
And was that was based on your earlier technology?
No, it was no. Bruce made his first homopolar generator before we ever made a generator. No, he made his first really functional homopolar generator at Sunburst Farms, which was a kind of a SRF, Self-Realization Fellowship spinoff, with a guy named Acharya Bernard, who was actually a very good engineer. But when you actually see his first generator, it's like an 1800s, 1880s, 1870s piece of antique furniture is what it looks like. It's beautiful. It's beautiful. Okay. The big old knife switch. Nothing sophisticated or state-of-the-art about it. It was very primitive and used carbon brushes, for Christ's sake. So it was a very primitive device. And he extrapolated a lot on his results, freely extrapolated on his results in a way that I found to be disconcerting and unscientific. But there was enough there between Faraday, who I was studying, and I tried to bring to Bruce, and Rolf Shafranki at NASA, who had written this book called Ether Technology, which I had been handed by a friend one day, who was one of Werner von Braun's cohorts from Nazi Germany, who'd been brought over with all those other people in the Brill and the other program.
Project Paperclip.
Yeah, and they were brought over, and they were given tattoos and told that they had been Jews, which was very difficult for some of them to pretend to have been Jews and to have been in Buchenwald or Auschwitz or something, but they were given cover stories. And I'm not saying that everybody who was a scientist working for the United States government who had a tattoo and a story like that was making a cover story, but there were a bunch of them. I could go through a whole list of people who this applies to, who we know about. We need to have a modus operandi that allows for not just my technologies, but the spectrum of technologies that people have invented before they were murdered. Okay, Ed Gray, my dear friend Ed Gray, who invented beautiful technologies, beautiful multiplicative technologies, 10 times, 20 times more power coming out than they used. In terms of multipliers, we went beyond that, but not in terms of practically applicable technology. We did have a 28 kilowatt magnetic generator that was in Scottsdale at one time that got confiscated or disappeared at any rate, let's put it that way. That was 60 hertz cycle compatible, that didn't require any outside fuel source, and we could have been 50 hertz cycle adapted easily. And there was a guy actually, and there's like the old Hubbard machine that was in Popular Science. Well, you can figure out what the energy product of a real rare earth magnet is, and it's enormous what you can exploit in terms of those kind of generators. And Ed Gray didn't even use that. Ed Gray used electromagnets, but arrayed in a specific kind of way with a spark gap that really changed the dynamics of the system. And he was murdered. I know he was murdered. He was my friend. And I know who killed him.
And how many of your technologies were confiscated or you got sidetracked on?
Let me put it this way. In what year was that? 1993 or 1994, Henry Landsman, Uncle Hank came out from Ames at NASA. This is a guy who didn't even like to take vacations. He was beyond retirement age, but he continued on as a consultant and arrived at work at 5:30 every morning out there. And he flew out and he said, Adam, the person you're working with is a milk machine. And I said, what do you mean? He says, he's a milk machine. They're milking you for your ideas. They want to get you on the phone and get you talking, because every time you talk, you're like revealing a new technology, a new idea. These people are bereft of ideas, and so they need to get them somewhere. And so they've got you in this kind of dialogue with this person, and he's a milk machine. And I said, no, he's not. He's a brilliant fucking engineer. Pardon my language, but that's what I said. And he said, no, actually, you may think he's a brilliant. I said, no, he is actually really a brilliant engineer. He may be also a milk machine, either intentionally or unintentionally. I do not know, but he's also a brilliant engineer. And he says, that being said, I can say this. You have an extraordinary IQ. You're an incredibly intelligent person. But in terms of social IQ, not so smart at all. He said, because you're being parasitized. And I said, the whole planet's being parasitized. You know that. Of all the people I know, you know that. You know these things, these back-engineered technologies exist where we have our own little flying discs flying around. Thank you, Martin Marietta, or actually, doesn't matter. I'm using old names. But Lockheed Martin, for example, we have our own technologies that we've reversed engineered from a more intelligent species, but we haven't evolved as a species enough until we actually are really being human. We're not even human yet. We are devolving because of our doping. It's like you depress the hell out of people with bad news every night, and then you feed them antidepressants, and you make trillions of dollars off of them. You feed them fluoride so they become impotent, and then you give them Viagra and other erectile dysfunction medications. And you tell me that's not organized crime? Don't tell me that's not organized crime. That is organized crime. That is the essence of organized crime. There's never been more organized crime. This makes Al Capone look like a total jerk amateur, what these guys are doing. Pretty Boy Floyd, all those guys who were supposed to be crooks back there during the Great Depression. The fact of the matter is the real criminals are the ones who are putting fluoride in your water and selling you Viagra. The ones who are feeding you a spectrum of carcinogens in your water and then bankrupting you, as in the United States, at least they're bankrupting people, as you get
not cured from cancer more often than not. And so if they get a 20% cure rate with a drug, they think it's a great thing. Give me a break. We know that there are better treatments. We know that there are better ways to approach this. We know that we have infinitely abundant energy that requires no fuel, that creates no pollution, and doesn't have to create bad electromagnetic noise. We know that every single household on this planet, in third world countries and in first world countries alike, could have their own power source in the back of their hovel or in the back of their mansion. And by the time you're done with it and you calculate the cost of this parasitic energy economy on the planet and on the human species, you would have enough to spread around so that basically everybody, not in some kind of Marxist, communist, or Maoist nonsense, communist kind of environment, but in a collective abundance, where instead of sharing scarcity and parceling out the field in that way, that we are actually sharing in universal abundance. That's what an intelligent species does. And when the hegemony decides that they want to acknowledge 0 point, they'll claim that they invented it, like it's a new idea, instead of an idea that's over 100 years old. It would be just as disingenuous for me to sit here and tell you and your listeners that I invented this. I've invented 7 different generations, 7 different types with co-workers, colleagues. I've co-invented a piezo ringing resonance generator, which uses piezo crystals and materials made with piezo crystals to create multiples, what we call quantum pumps, to create multiples of what we put into it. And we've been doing this for years. And there's people inside the United States government at Los Alamos, Lawrence Livermore. I could go on. And I know there's people in Canada who've been doing this for years and years, but you don't hear about it.
Okay, and the last clip that we're going to be considering from this long interview, Trombly's going to talk about attempts that were made on his own life and how he was basically warned several times that if he tries to make another of these energy devices that the next bullet won't miss, quote unquote. And then he's going to conclude with the motivating call to arms that we need to come together to embrace the possibilities of this new paradigm. I think that this interview with Adam Trombly is very important for understanding the dynamics of this underground world of black projects and secret science. And it also gives us, through his account, a more personal approach to understanding the reality of how people have interfaced with this over the years. And it really does exist. So it's hard to find information about, but this is a rare instance where we can get a first-hand account of somebody's encounters with this force. So I'm going to conclude things with that. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in.
I can tell you there's been at least one attempt on my life for every year I've lived, okay? And I'm talking about to the point where I actually have been physically poisoned, not where the bullet missed, which happened once. Went right by my ear, a 50 cal bullet did, but it missed. But I got very fascinated that it got that close at the distance that we determined it had to have come from. So I studied long-range shooting as a result of that. And just, it's a fascinating thing. It's an interesting little weird destructive science. But it's also interesting. It's a lot of kinds of ballistics and windage and all kinds of things you got to take into account.
So somebody takes a shot at your head,
yeah,
and you go into the science of that.
Yeah, of course, because I wanted to understand how he got that close. I thank God that I moved my head at the right moment, and that I could actually feel the breeze of it. It wasn't just that I heard it; I felt the breeze of it, and then the thunk in the earth right behind me, and then I dug it out, and it's okay. Holy shit! Glad that missed. Duck and cover.
Yeah.
You bet your life I did not stay there.
You made a run for the house with
It was like it suddenly occurred to me, what the hell am I doing? It's like I'm crawling around. This guy could shoot me again or try to shoot me again. But that was only one time. But the fact of the matter is that doesn't matter because they're killing everybody. You see, I've been speaking mantrically again since 1979, 1980 about the global Auschwitz that we are all being subjected to. The earth itself has been turned into a concentration camp. It's a very small group of people who are aware of all these things, okay? Who are aware of most of it at least. And their implementation of it can only be considered parasitic, their implication of all their policies. Why is it that we're fighting these wars constantly? Why is it that trillions of dollars of debt are being accumulated in the destruction of planet Earth? When you invest in life, the payback is life. It's like it's all partitioned in people's psyches this way so that the people who are killing us, literally, can get away with it. And I don't know why you could say they're aliens and they're just exploiting the crap out of the resources until they're finished destroying the planet, which is what it looks like is happening. You could say that. But whether they're actually aliens from another world who are doing this, or it's just an agenda that's alien to the good of all life, it doesn't really matter, does it? They're parasites. And we need to exorcise them from our political systems. We need to exorcise them from our academic systems. We need to exorcise them from our corporate systems. It's not that all corporations are bad, but we need to have a different modus operandi. The people who are really running this thing is a very small group of people. I know very rich people who are billionaires. I know quite a few of them actually in my life. And they don't know it. They haven't known it. I sit down and talk to them and they say, I didn't know that. I didn't know that. And then they go to their science advisors and their science advisors tell them, like back in the 90s, their science advisors tell them, well, that's bullshit. That's just not true. I mean, I'm just one guy in this movement. I'm just one guy.
Yeah, you're just one inventor. There's been Sparky Sweet and
there's
Dennis
Sparky
Lee.
Sweet and all these. There's Hubbard. Look at these guys. It's like T. Townsend Brown, who was another friend of mine, who I met in the elevator going to our patent attorneys. We had the same patent attorney. And then we were on the elevator one day, and I looked at him and I said, you look really familiar. And he says, uh-huh. And I said, my name's Adam Trombly. Can I ask you your name? And he goes, my name is T. Townsend Brown. And I was like blown away because this is one of the electrogravitics. This is a guy who was one of the first guys. He's a major figure.
Right.
And we ended up having a beautiful, long conversation.
According to John Lear, his father, William Lear, was working very closely with Townsend Brown, and they had worked together on anti-gravity.
Yes.
And I was like, okay, so why don't I have a car? That's
because
off the ground.
Let me tell you what happened. Hazel Henderson is the former head of the Office of Technology and Assessment for the United States government. And she's a brilliant woman. She's really a neat person in a lot of ways. When she was head of OTA, Office of Technology Assessment, she had a special file for my work. And the reason I know this is because at the 2000 State of the World Forum in New York City, she walked up to me with Friedhof Capra, the Tao of Physics, the author of the Tao of Physics. And she said, in front of Ambassador George, former Canadian ambassador to Kuwait, former Canadian ambassador to Iran, former high commissioner to India, and basically in front of him and in front of a whole group of other scientists and things, she came up and she goes, Adam, I owe you an apology. She goes, I don't know if you remember me. And of course, I vaguely remembered her. And I said, and what is that you're apologizing for? She goes, my name is Hazel Henderson. And I said, yes, I know. And when I was head of Office of Technology Assessment, I used to put any new technology with your name on it in a special file. I said, what was that, file 13? She goes, no, I didn't throw it in the wastebasket. I literally had a special file for your stuff. And I participated in the suppression thereof, anything that had your name on it. I said, why was that? She goes, people barely drive in two dimensions in four-wheel cars. They can barely drive with internal combustion engines. What are they going to be doing? They're floating around in their zero-point powered Ford flying saucers or Porsche flying saucers. What kind of chaos would that be? She goes, I couldn't even imagine this species with that kind of power. I said, I see. She goes, yes, I did. I made that judgment as the head of the Office of Technology Assessment for the United States government. Here's the thing. We haven't been allowed to do any of it. It's the bottom line. We have offered solution after solution. Individual after individual, group after group has offered solution after solution. We have physically demonstrated cold fusion, okay? We have physically demonstrated it and still gotten clobbered, gotten defunded, gotten marginalized, anathematized, okay? I had a period of time here in Aspen, Colorado, where people were coming into bars and trying to pretend they were locals. And they would saddle up to the bars at Ichi's sushi restaurant, and they would say, hey, have you ever heard of this guy, Adam Trombly? He's what a fake, ha, 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 fun. And not knowing that the guy at the bar, the bartender, and the owner basically were my friends. And so we would play it. We would just sit there and let these guys spew their filth into the air and their misinformation. And then I would announce my presence, or they would introduce me to them. And then they would jump out of their chairs and run out of the building usually. Because this is the kind of disinformation campaign that has been used against me, against De Palma, against all kinds of people. And I'm not saying poor me. I had friends, so I wasn't poor me at all. My friends knew that I wasn't bullshitting them.
There's been multiple people who run into this, tried to scale the ramparts of the free energy paradigm, and they've never made it to the moat.
This is why we need a movement. Okay, people ask me, why is it you don't just build more of these things? Every single time I build one, we get raided. Every time I build one, we get tormented, tortured. I have people flying into town, meeting me clandestinely and telling me that I can talk about it all I want, but if I build another one, they're going to make sure the next bullet doesn't miss. I literally had this happen just 2 years ago. The guy flew in to meet with me and sat down, and that's what he said to me in front of Nancy. And then they started I get poisoned again anyway. I have only deleted expletives to say to those people. And ultimately, I know that the most evil being in the midst of infinity will suffer radical decompression, will be transformed. Every atom and molecule, every particle of their psychophysical presence and all of its entanglement will be liberated ultimately. And this is true of everything and everybody. And it's really good news. There is no eternal damnation. There is no eternal universe like this one. This universe is temporal. It is being transformed as we speak. It is being transformed in reality. And it will be transformed. And we can participate in the transformation in real time, or we can deny it and suffer the consequences. That's the choice that we have. We need to choose between life and a very slow and torturous death. That's what we need to remember. We need to remember with every day and with every breath that we have an obligation and a responsibility to life, which is quite remarkable. I love nothing more than spending time at a microscope or walking through a forest. And I'm joined by billions of people who would also equally enjoy those things, and who many of whom do, at least the forest part of it, where they can still find them. And the fact is that we have an emergency. We can't afford to spend another day fighting another war. What's it going to take? What's it going to take before people actually stand up and make a difference? How many towns, how many villages, how many cities have to be destroyed? How many millions of people have to suffer this poisoning before they say enough is enough? And we seize control of our political structures, and we seize control of our economic structures, and we say no more internal combustion engines. Only 0 point from this day forward, okay? We don't have time for much of a transitional economy anymore. We can say, okay, solar and wind, good. Solar and wind are great, but we need 0 point, 0 point, 0 point, and we need it now. 0 point modules have existed, do exist, and should exist into the future. Warp drives, all the things that you've ever dreamed about and beyond in Star Trek can absolutely occur, or you can suffer slow, torturous death, constant environmental degradation, constant degradation of your life, bankruptcy, homelessness. It's your choice. You can have universal abundance, or you can be continually subjected to the IMF, the World Bank, and the central banking system of this world. I'm just a guy who's a witness to it. I'm a scientist. I'm a witness to it. I can testify to the reality of it. I can testify to the reality of the intelligence behind it. I can tell you it's not alien from life, this intelligence, that the intelligence that denies it is alien to life. And so we need to rid ourselves of that stupidity. We need to rid ourselves of the parasites. We need to take our medicine, and we need to move into a new world or die trying. It's just that simple.